The early morning sun cast long shadows across Chicago's federal courthouse steps as Sarah Mitchell made her way through the brass-handled doors at precisely 7:15 a.m. The clicking of her sensible black heels echoed through the marble hallway, still quiet at this early hour. She had always believed in being the first one in and the last one out, a habit that had served her well throughout her career. Sarah's dark curls were neatly pulled back into a professional bun, and her navy blue suit was pressed to perfection. At 32 years old, she had already accomplished what many lawyers spent their entire careers dreaming about. As one of the youngest federal prosecutors in the Department of Justice's history, she had earned her position through nothing but pure merit, determination, and countless late nights. Today was different from her usual routine. Instead of preparing for a federal case, she was heading to the state courthouse for a special joint task force case. The case involved a complex drug trafficking ring that crossed both state and federal jurisdictions. Sarah had been specifically chosen to handle the prosecution due to her impressive track record with similar cases. In her office, she spread out her materials on the mahogany desk she had inherited from her mentor. The morning light filtered through the blinds, illuminating the degrees on her wall: Harvard Law School, magna cum laude, and her undergraduate degree from Yale. Next to them hung the photo of her grandmother, a former civil rights activist who had marched with Dr. King. Sarah often looked at that picture when she needed strength. As she reviewed her notes one final time, she couldn't help but smile at the meticulous organization. Each document was color-coded, each argument carefully crafted, and every possible counter-argument had been considered and addressed. The case file in front of her represented 3 months of intensive investigation and preparation. She had personally interviewed key witnesses, coordinated with local law enforcement, and spent countless hours ensuring every detail was perfect. Her assistant, Tom, knocked on the doorframe before entering with her usual morning coffee. "Big day today, Miss Mitchell," he said, placing the cup on her desk. Sarah nodded, taking a careful sip of the hot liquid. Tom had been with her since her first day at the office, and he knew exactly how she liked her coffee: 1 cream, no sugar. "The state courthouse is different territory," Tom added, his voice carrying a hint of concern. Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. As one of the few black women in her position, she had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and whispered doubts. But she had learned long ago that the best response was excellence, undeniable, irrefutable excellence. She checked her briefcase one last time: case files, evidence photographs, witness statements, and her laptop. Everything was in its place. Sarah had developed a reputation for being overprepared, but in her experience, there was no such thing. Every detail mattered, every piece of evidence could be crucial, and every moment in court was an opportunity to serve justice. Standing up, she straightened her jacket and grabbed her briefcase. The weight of it was reassuring, the product of months of work, ready to be presented. As she walked through the office, several junior attorneys nodded respectfully. They had all heard about the joint task force case, and many had asked to observe her in court. Sarah had always made time to mentor younger lawyers, especially minorities who faced the same challenges she had overcome. Before leaving her office, Sarah took one last look at her grandmother's photo. The woman's determined smile reminded her of everything she represented, not just herself, but generations of struggle and progress. She touched the photo briefly, a morning ritual that grounded her in her purpose. The drive to the state courthouse would take 20 minutes. Sarah preferred to arrive early to familiarize herself with the courtroom and review her opening statement one final time. As she walked to her car in the underground parking garage, she mentally rehearsed key points of her argument. The facts were on her side, the evidence was solid, and she was more than prepared. What Sarah couldn't know, as she pulled out of the parking garage into the Chicago morning traffic, was that this day would test more than just her legal expertise. It would challenge her composure, her dignity, and her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. But for now, she was simply focused on the case ahead, confident in her preparation and ready to serve justice as she had always done, with excellence, integrity, and unwavering determination. Judge Robert Henderson arrived at his chambers at exactly 8:30 a.m., just as he had done every workday for the past 20 years. His morning routine never changed: hang up his coat, adjust his black robe in front of the mirror, and review the day's docket with his clerk, Jessica. At 63, Henderson prided himself on running what he considered the most efficient courtroom in the state courthouse. His silver hair was always perfectly combed, his robe pristinely pressed, and his courtroom rules strictly enforced. The other judges called him Old School Bob behind his back, but he took it as a compliment. "Your Honor," Jessica said, walking into his chambers with a stack of files. "We have a joint task force case first thing this morning. Federal prosecution is taking the lead." She placed the files on his large oak desk, which he'd inherited from his father, also a judge. Henderson frowned, adjusting his reading glasses. He didn't like federal prosecutors coming into his courtroom. In his view, they'd always acted superior, as if their federal badges made them better than state prosecutors. "Who's the prosecutor?" he asked, flipping through the case files. "I'm not sure, Your Honor. The name isn't listed on the morning brief. Just says, Federal Prosecutor, Northern District." Jessica shuffled through some papers, double-checking. "Probably some hotshot from downtown thinking they can waltz in here and run my courtroom," Henderson muttered. He took pride in his courtroom's traditional atmosphere. Everyone had their place, everyone followed his rules, and everything ran like clockwork. Through his office window, Henderson watched the usual morning crowd filing into the courthouse. After 2 decades on the bench, he could usually tell who was who just by looking at them. The lawyers always carried briefcases and walked quickly. The defendants usually looked nervous, often accompanied by family members. The witnesses moved uncertainly, checking room numbers as they walked. At 8:55 a.m., Henderson began his usual pre-court routine. He straightened his bow tie, he'd worn one every day since law school, and reviewed his notes one final time. The case today involved a major drug trafficking operation. He'd handled hundreds of drug cases over the years, and he had strong opinions about how they should be prosecuted. "Time to start, Your Honor," Jessica announced at precisely 9:00 a.m. Henderson nodded, picking up his gavel. As he walked toward his courtroom, he mentally prepared himself for what he expected to be another routine day. The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Robert Henderson presiding." Henderson walked to his bench with measured steps, his robe flowing behind him. He liked this part, the respect, the tradition, the authority it represented. As he settled into his chair, Henderson surveyed his courtroom with practiced eyes. The defense attorneys were in their usual spot, looking through papers. Several police officers sat in the gallery, waiting to testify. Everything seemed normal, except. His eyes stopped at the prosecutor's table. Instead of the usual sight of one of the regular state prosecutors he knew well, he saw a young black woman in a navy suit sitting quietly, reviewing documents. She hadn't announced herself to his clerk, hadn't followed the usual protocol of introducing herself before court began. In Henderson's mind, this was already strike one against proper courtroom procedure. He watched as she organized her papers, seemingly unaware of his attention. In his 20 years on the bench, he developed certain expectations about how things should be. Federal prosecutor or not, his courtroom had rules, and in his experience, real federal prosecutors didn't look like the woman sitting at the prosecutor's table. Henderson felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen many young lawyers come through his courtroom thinking they could ignore traditional protocols. He believed it was his duty to maintain proper order and respect for the court. In his mind, he was already forming the words he would use to remind everyone in his courtroom about proper procedures and respect for the court's traditions. The clock on the wall showed 9:05 a.m. Usually, by this time, the prosecutor would have introduced themselves and stated their readiness to proceed. But the woman at the prosecutor's table continued reviewing her documents, as if waiting for something. Henderson drummed his fingers on his bench, his irritation growing. What happened in the next few minutes would shatter his comfortable world of assumptions and trigger a chain of events that would force him to confront his own deeply held biases. But for now, Judge Robert Henderson simply sat in his high-backed chair, ready to assert his authority in what he considered his domain. The tension in courtroom 302 grew thicker with each passing second. The old wall clock ticked loudly, marking every moment of the increasingly uncomfortable silence. Sarah Mitchell continued organizing her documents at the prosecutor's table, unaware that she had become the focus of Judge Henderson's mounting irritation. At exactly 9:07 a.m., Judge Henderson cleared his throat loudly. When Sarah didn't immediately look up, his face reddened slightly. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the judge's telltale signs of annoyance. The defense attorneys exchanged nervous glances, sensing the storm that was about to break. "Excuse me, young lady," Judge Henderson's voice boomed across the courtroom, making several people jump in their seats. "This is a federal drug trafficking case. The defendant's table is on the other side." His tone dripped with condescension, each word carefully chosen to remind everyone of his authority. The entire courtroom froze, the scratching of pens stopped. Someone's coffee cup halted midway to their mouth. In the gallery, a veteran court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenograph, her eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah slowly raised her head, her face a mask of professional calm. But before she could speak, Judge Henderson continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "If you're waiting for your attorney, I suggest you join the other defendants in the holding area. We run a tight ship here, and I won't have people wandering around my courtroom disrupting proceedings." A few gasps echoed through the room. In the back row, two young law clerks whispered to each other, their faces showing a mix of shock and second-hand embarrassment. One of the defense attorneys, Mark Thompson, who had worked with Sarah on previous federal cases, started to stand up, but Sarah gave him a subtle shake of her head. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, if you're here for a different case, the public defender's office is down the hall to the left. They can help you find where you're supposed to be." He gestured dismissively toward the door. Sarah remained seated, her back straight as a rod. Her hands, resting on the table, didn't tremble. Years of facing similar assumptions had taught her how to handle such moments with grace. The only sign of her inner tension was a slight tightening around her eyes. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual sounds of the courthouse, the distant echo of voices in the hallway, the shuffle of papers, the squeak of chairs, seemed muted, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Judge Henderson, interpreting her silence as defiance, leaned forward on his bench. His face had turned a deeper shade of red, and his bow tie seemed to quiver with indignation. "Young woman, I don't know how you got in here, but this is a federal case involving serious drug charges. This is not a place for spectators or lost civilians. I'm ordering you to." "Your Honor." Sarah's voice cut through his words like a laser through fog. She stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. The navy blue suit she wore suddenly seemed to carry the weight of her federal authority. "I am Federal Prosecutor Sarah Mitchell, representing the United States government in this case." The effect was immediate. Judge Henderson's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. His face, which had been flushed with authority, drained of color. In the gallery, someone coughed to cover what might have been a laugh. "I have my credentials right here," Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her Department of Justice identification. "Would you like to examine them, Your Honor?" The court clerk, Jessica, hurried forward to take the credentials to the judge. As she walked back to her desk, her face flaming with embarrassment, the only sound in the courtroom was the sharp click of her heels on the floor. Judge Henderson stared at the credentials as if they might bite him. His hands, usually steady from years of handling court documents, trembled slightly as he examined the federal prosecutor's badge and ID. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The power dynamic that Judge Henderson had taken for granted just moments ago had been turned on its head. Several attorneys in the gallery were now watching intently, some taking notes, others simply witnessing what they knew would become a courthouse legend. Sarah remained standing, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. She had faced similar situations before, though perhaps not quite so public or dramatic. In her mind, she could hear her grandmother's voice. "Sometimes, baby, the best response to ignorance is excellence." The next few moments would determine how this confrontation would play out, not just for today's case, but for the broader implications it would have throughout the legal community. The weight of the moment hung in the air, heavy with possibility and consequence. Time seemed to stand still in courtroom 302 as Judge Henderson held Sarah Mitchell's federal credentials in his trembling hands. The gold Department of Justice badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, seeming to mock his earlier assumptions. The silence in the room was broken only by the gentle whir of the air conditioning system. I see," Judge Henderson finally managed to say, his voice having lost its previous authority. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Miss Mitchell, that is, the court apologizes for the confusion. The words seemed to physically pain him as they left his mouth. Sarah remained standing, her posture perfect, her face professionally neutral. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "If it pleases the court, I'm prepared to proceed with the United States case against Mr. Thompson." She didn't acknowledge the judge's discomfort or his weak apology. Instead, she opened her perfectly organized case file. In the gallery, the atmosphere had changed completely. The court officers who had been dozing off were now fully alert. Law students who had come to observe regular proceedings were frantically taking notes. Several veteran attorneys exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this kind of scene before, though perhaps never quite so dramatically. Jessica, the court clerk, busied herself with papers, her face still red with embarrassment. She had worked with Judge Henderson for 5 years and had never seen him so thoroughly knocked off balance. She sneaked glances at Sarah, noting how the federal prosecutor's calm demeanor made her seem like the most powerful person in the room. Judge Henderson struggled to regain his mental footing. In his 20 years on the bench, he had never faced such a dramatic reversal. His mind raced with the potential consequences. The other judges would hear about this, the legal community would talk, and his reputation for running a controlled courtroom might be forever tarnished. "Yes, well," he fumbled with his gavel, nearly dropping it. "Ms. Mitchell, please proceed with your opening statement." He tried to sound normal, but his voice had lost its usual authoritative boom. Sarah stood gracefully, buttoning her suit jacket with a practiced motion. The simple act somehow emphasized her preparation and professionalism. She moved to the center of the courtroom, carrying just one slim folder, a sharp contrast to the many attorneys who appeared before Judge Henderson laden with stacks of papers. "Your Honor, members of the court," she began. She had transformed what could have been a humiliating confrontation into a masterclass in professional excellence. The morning's events would be discussed in legal circles for years to come, but for now, she remained focused on the case at hand, ready to serve justice as she had always done, with unwavering dignity and exceptional skill. As the morning session continued, Sarah Mitchell transformed Courtroom 302 into a masterclass in legal excellence. Each movement, each word, each piece of evidence she presented showed why she had risen so quickly in the Department of Justice. The same judge who had tried to humiliate her now found himself repeatedly nodding in agreement with her arguments. "Your Honor, the government calls Special Agent Thomas Rodriguez," Sarah announced, her voice confident and clear. She stood with perfect posture, her navy suit as crisp as it had been at dawn. The morning's confrontation seemed like a distant memory, though the tension in Judge Henderson's shoulders showed he hadn't forgotten. As the FBI agent took the stand, Sarah began her questioning with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't just ask questions, she told a story. Each answer built upon the last, creating a clear picture of the drug trafficking operation for everyone in the courtroom. Even the court reporter found herself caught up in the narrative, nearly forgetting to type as she listened. "Agent Rodriguez, could you please explain to the court what you discovered during your surveillance on May 15th? Sarah's questions were simple but powerful. She never used complicated legal terms when simple words would do. This was another skill that set her apart, making complex federal cases easy to understand. In his high seat, Judge Henderson watched with growing admiration and shame. Where he had expected to find incompetence, he discovered extraordinary skill. Each time he looked for a mistake in her procedure, he found only perfection. The weight of his earlier behavior pressed heavily on his conscience. During a particularly complex piece of evidence about money laundering, Sarah smoothly incorporated visual aids. She had prepared clear, professional charts that made the complicated money trails easy to follow. The jurors, who usually struggled to stay awake during financial testimony, leaned forward in their seats, fully engaged. "Permission to approach the witness, Your Honor?" Sarah would ask periodically. Each time, Judge Henderson found himself responding more quickly, more respectfully. Gone was his earlier condescension. In its place was something that looked very much like awe. During the morning break, the courthouse buzzed with excitement. Young law clerks huddled in corners, discussing Sarah's performance. "Did you see how she handled the evidence chain?" One whispered. "I've never seen Judge Henderson so quiet during a prosecutor's presentation," another added. Back in the courtroom, Sarah continued her methodical presentation. When the defense attorney objected to one of her questions, she calmly cited 3 separate legal precedents supporting her position. Judge Henderson had no choice but to overrule the objection. The defense attorney slumped in his chair, looking overwhelmed. "Your Honor," Sarah said, approaching the bench during a brief sidebar, "I anticipate needing 20 more minutes with this witness." Her time management was impeccable. Judge Henderson, who usually bristled at prosecutors going over their estimated times, simply nodded in agreement. The gallery had grown more crowded as word spread through the courthouse about her performance. Several other judges had sent their clerks to observe, supposedly to take notes on proper courtroom procedure. In reality, they wanted to witness firsthand the federal prosecutor who had humbled Judge Henderson. Sarah's case presentation continued like a well-orchestrated symphony. Each piece of evidence was perfectly prepared, every witness thoroughly prepared. When she played a surveillance recording, the audio was crystal clear. She had even prepared transcripts for the jury to follow along. The defense team's table looked increasingly disorganized in comparison. Papers spilled across their surface, sticky notes poked out of files at odd angles. Next to them, Sarah's table remained a model of organization, each document ready exactly when needed. As the afternoon approached, Sarah's performance had done more than just present a strong case. She had shown everyone in that courtroom what true professionalism looked like. She had transformed a moment of prejudice into an opportunity to demonstrate excellence. Judge Henderson found himself struggling with new emotions. Each time he had to address her as Ms. Mitchell or Counselor, he felt a fresh wave of embarrassment about his earlier behavior. The very competence he had doubted was now on display in a way he couldn't ignore. By the time Sarah called her final witness of the day, the atmosphere in courtroom 302 had completely transformed. The same room that had witnessed her humiliation that morning now felt like her classroom, and everyone, from the bailiff to Judge Henderson himself, had become her students in professional excellence. "The government rests for today, Your Honor," Sarah finally announced, her voice as strong and clear as it had been hours ago. She hadn't just presented a case, she had delivered a powerful message about judgment, prejudice, and the importance of looking beyond assumptions. And she had done it all without ever mentioning the morning's incident, letting her work speak for itself. News of what happened in courtroom 302 spread through the Chicago legal community like wildfire. By lunchtime, every courthouse coffee cart and cafeteria table buzzed with discussion about the federal prosecutor who had turned Judge Henderson's prejudice into a powerful demonstration of excellence. Lisa Chen, a young Asian-American law clerk, sat with her colleagues in the courthouse cafe. "I was there when it happened," she told the eager group around her. Judge Henderson's face turned white as paper when she showed her credentials. She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "You know, last month he mistook me for a translator. Twice." In the judge's private dining room, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Henderson sat alone at his usual table, his sandwich untouched. Other judges walked past, some shooting disapproving glances, others looking uncomfortable. Judge Maria Rodriguez, one of the few female judges on the bench, finally approached his table. "Bob," she said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation, "we need to talk about what happened this morning." Her voice was kind but firm. "This isn't just about one incident. This is about a pattern we can't ignore anymore." Meanwhile, in the public defender's office, Sarah's performance had become an inspiration. Denise Washington, a black public defender with 15 years of experience, gathered her junior attorneys. "What happened today isn't new," she explained. "But Sarah Mitchell showed us all how to handle it. Excellence is the best response to prejudice." The courthouse security guards shared the story during their shift change. Officer James Thompson, who had worked there for 20 years, shook his head as he described the scene. "Never seen anything like it," he said. "That lawyer didn't raise her voice once. Didn't need to. Her work spoke louder than any shouting could." By mid-afternoon, local legal blogs had picked up the story. Comments poured in from lawyers across the city, many sharing similar experiences. A Pakistani-American attorney wrote about being mistaken for a defendant. A Hispanic lawyer described being asked to show her bar card while her white colleagues walked right in. In the law school across town, Professor Rachel Goldman adjusted her afternoon lecture. "Today, we're going to discuss something that happened in court this morning," she told her ethics and legal practice class. It's a perfect example of why representation matters and how professionalism can be the most powerful response to prejudice. Sarah's own office at the federal building was flooded with messages. Young lawyers wanted to know if she would mentor them. Senior attorneys called to express their support. Her assistant, Tom, struggled to manage the constant phone calls and emails. "Miss Mitchell," Tom said, poking his head into her office, "the Chicago Bar Association wants you to speak at next month's diversity panel." He paused, checking his notes. "And 3 law firms have called about partner positions." Back at the state courthouse, Judge Henderson's clerk, Jessica, spent her afternoon differently than usual. Instead of organizing case files, she found herself thinking about all the times she had seen similar assumptions made. She had never spoken up, telling herself it wasn't her place. Now she wondered if her silence had made her part of the problem. In the courthouse parking garage, 2 veteran court reporters discussed the day's events while walking to their cars. "You should have seen the defense attorney's face," one said. "He thought he was getting an easy day when he saw her walk in. By lunch, he looked like he wished he'd called in sick." The story reached the local legal community's social media groups. #Courtroom302 started trending among Chicago lawyers. Posts shared similar stories, celebrated Sarah's composure, and called for changes in how the justice system handled diversity. At the end of the court day, Judge Henderson sat alone in his chambers. His bow tie lay untied around his neck as he stared at the wall of photos showing his 20 years on the bench. For the first time, he noticed something he had never seen before. In every picture, almost every face looked just like his. The cleaning staff found Sarah's business card on the courtroom floor while sweeping up. The simple white card with Department of Justice letterhead said more than any speech could have. One of the cleaners, an elderly black woman, smiled as she carefully placed it on the prosecutor's table for tomorrow. By evening, the story had reached the chief judge's office. A memo began circulating about mandatory bias training for all courthouse staff. What had started as one judge's prejudiced assumptions had sparked a conversation that would change how the entire courthouse operated. As the sun set over Chicago's legal district, the day's events had set in motion changes that would ripple through the justice system for years to come. Sarah Mitchell hadn't just won a courtroom battle. She had started a revolution in how the legal community thought about prejudice, professionalism, and power. 2 weeks after the incident in courtroom 302, the Chicago legal community began to see real changes. The chief judge's office had called an emergency meeting of all district judges, something that hadn't happened in over 5 years. The large conference room buzzed with nervous energy as judges filed in, Judge Henderson noticeably sitting in the back row. Chief Judge Patricia Martinez stood at the podium, her expression serious. "What happened in courtroom 302 was not an isolated incident," she began, her voice firm. "Today, we're announcing new mandatory training programs for every person who works in our courthouse system." The training would start at the top. Judges would attend workshops led by diversity experts from across the country. Court staff, from clerks to security guards, would participate in monthly sessions about recognizing and addressing bias. Even the cafeteria workers and cleaning staff would receive training to ensure the entire courthouse became a more inclusive environment. Sarah Mitchell had been invited to help design these programs. She sat in her federal office, reviewing the proposed training materials with her assistant, Tom. "We need to make sure this isn't just about checking boxes," she explained, marking notes in the margins. "Real change happens when people understand why this matters." The Bar Association formed a new committee focused on diversity in the courtroom. They named it the Mitchell Initiative, though Sarah had tried to decline the honor. "This isn't about me," she had told them. "It's about making sure no lawyer faces what I faced that day." Still, the name stuck, becoming a symbol of change in the Chicago legal community. Judge Henderson, required to attend the first training session, sat uncomfortably in a small group discussion. The facilitator, Dr. James Wilson, a respected expert on institutional bias, asked each judge to share experiences of when they might have made assumptions about others. I assumed a federal prosecutor was a defendant," Henderson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "because of her race." Speaking the words out loud made him flinch. Other judges nodded, some sharing their own stories of mistakes and prejudices they had never acknowledged before. In the courthouse hallways, small changes appeared. New signs went up clearly stating that all officers of the court deserved equal respect. The security desk stopped asking minority lawyers to show extra ID. The court clerk's office began keeping records of any reported incidents of bias or discrimination. Law firms across Chicago started their own internal reviews. Senior partners examined their hiring practices, promotion records, and client assignments. Many discovered patterns they hadn't noticed before or had chosen to ignore. The managing partner of Wilson and Grace, one of the city's largest firms, called an all-staff meeting. "We've been part of the problem," she admitted to the packed conference room. "Starting today, we're going to be part of the solution." The firm announced new mentoring programs for minority lawyers and set strict diversity goals for partner promotions. Back at the state courthouse, Jessica, Judge Henderson's clerk, noticed changes in her boss. The judge now greeted every lawyer who entered his courtroom the same way, regardless of their appearance. He had removed the old photos from his wall, replacing them with artwork showing diverse scenes from Chicago's legal history. The local law schools responded too. Professor Goldman's ethics class became standing room, only as she incorporated discussions about bias in the legal system. What happened in courtroom 302 wasn't just about one judge and one lawyer, she told her students. It was about the assumptions we all carry and how they affect justice. Sarah received invitations to speak at law schools across the country. Though she accepted only a few, her message remained consistent. Excellence is not limited by race, gender, or background. Justice should be truly blind, not selectively sighted. The courthouse maintenance staff noticed changes too. Marie Johnson, who had cleaned the courts for 30 years, smiled as she saw more diverse faces in lawyers' robes. "Things are different now," she told her coworkers. "Still not perfect, but different." Judge Henderson took one final step that surprised everyone. He requested to be part of the new mentoring program for minority law students. "I can't change what I did," he told the program coordinator. "I can help change what happens next." 6 months after the incident, the Chicago legal community had transformed. New policies were in place, training was ongoing, and conversations about bias happened openly instead of in whispers. The Mitchell Initiative had become a model for other cities looking to address similar issues in their legal systems. What started as one judge's prejudiced assumptions had sparked a movement for change. Sarah Mitchell hadn't just won a case that day in courtroom 302. She had helped begin the process of making justice truly blind. 1 year after the incident in courtroom 302, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Legal Conference Center. More than 500 judges, lawyers, and legal professionals filled the room. The occasion was the first annual Diversity in Justice Conference, an event that had grown from the seeds planted by that memorable morning in court. "When I walked into that courtroom a year ago," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, "I was just thinking about winning my case. I didn't know I was walking into a moment that would change our legal community." The audience listened in complete silence, many nodding in recognition of the story they had heard so many times. In the front row, Judge Henderson sat with his hands folded in his lap. He looked different now, humbler, more thoughtful. The past year had changed him in ways he never expected. When Sarah had invited him to speak at the conference, he had almost declined. But he knew his story needed to be part of the larger lesson. "The hardest thing," Judge Henderson would tell the audience later, "is admitting that you've been wrong for so long. The second hardest thing is doing something about it." His voice shook slightly as he spoke, but he continued. "I'm not proud of what I did that day, but I'm proud of what we've all done since." The changes in the Chicago legal system had become a model for other cities. Representatives from New York, Los Angeles, and Miami sat in the audience, taking notes and planning similar programs for their own courthouses. The Mitchell Initiative had grown beyond its local roots, spreading across the country. During the lunch break, young lawyers crowded around Sarah's table. Many shared their own stories of facing prejudice in courtrooms and law firms. But now, these stories came with a difference. They talked about how they had used Sarah's example to handle these situations with professional excellence. "Ms. Mitchell showed us that we don't have to choose between fighting back and being professional," said Jennifer Wam, a young Asian American attorney. "We can challenge prejudice by being so good at what we do that no one can ignore us." Back in courtroom 302, things had changed too. A plaque now hung by the door, reading, Justice sees no color, only truth. It had been Judge Henderson's idea, a daily reminder to everyone who entered that courtroom. The old judge who had once made assumptions based on appearance now regularly hosted law student groups, sharing his story as a lesson in humility and growth. Sarah's case record over the past year had been impressive. She had won several major federal cases, earned a promotion, and started a mentoring program for minority law students. But her biggest impact wasn't in her legal victories. It was in how she had changed the conversation about diversity in the legal profession. Success isn't just about winning cases, she told a group of law students during the conference's afternoon session. It's about making sure everyone has a fair chance to show what they can do. The students scribbled notes eagerly, many seeing in Sarah the kind of lawyer they hoped to become. Professor Goldman from the law school had turned the incident into a required case study for her ethics class. This story teaches us that change can happen in unexpected moments, she explained to the conference attendees, but only if we're brave enough to handle those moments with grace and strength. As the conference drew to a close, Sarah shared the stage with Judge Henderson. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The federal prosecutor and the state judge, standing together as examples of how the legal system could learn and grow. A year ago, we were on opposite sides of a moment of prejudice, Sarah said. Today, we're on the same side of progress. Judge Henderson nodded, tears visible in his eyes. The conference ended with the announcement of new scholarships for minority law students, funded by contributions from law firms across the city. Each scholarship would carry the name of a lawyer who had faced and overcome prejudice in their career, ensuring that their stories would inspire future generations. As Sarah packed up her materials after the conference, a young black girl approached her. "My mom's a lawyer," the girl said shyly. "She says you helped make it easier for people like us in court." Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. "And maybe someday you'll make it even better," she replied with a warm smile. The story of Courtroom 302 had become more than just a dramatic moment in Chicago's legal history. It had become a lesson in how prejudice could be confronted with professionalism, how mistakes could lead to growth, and how one person's excellence could open doors for others. The legacy would continue, touching lives far beyond that one morning in court.